The wine hit the dress before she even saw the hand move. Not an accident, not a slip, a pour. Slow, deliberate, and surgical, the kind of cruelty that requires an audience to feel real. And director Han made sure he had one. The white silk absorbed it in real time. Anita Gray did not gasp, did not reach for a napkin, did not look down at the ruin spreading across her gown like a wound. She simply stood in the middle of the Lotte World Tower's grand ballroom, surrounded by 5 men in charcoal and navy, surrounded by chandeliers and champagne, and the kind of money that believes it is invincible, and she looked at Han with an expression so composed, so devastatingly unmoved, that one of the junior executives to his left actually stopped laughing for a moment. Just a moment. Because something about that stillness didn't sit right. But Han was not a man who listened to instinct. Han was a man who listened to power, and right now, power told him that Jiwon was not here. That Jiwan was locked inside a clan war 3 floors above the city, bleeding influence by the hour. That Jiwan, the ghost of Seoul, the man whose name security forces in 4 countries refused to say aloud in open rooms, had finally left this woman exposed. Beg, Han said, not loudly. He didn't need volume. He had 5 suits, 30 witnesses, and a camera on his phone already unlocked. Beg, and I'll consider not releasing what I know about your husband's accounts by morning. The room didn't go silent. Silence would have been mercy. The room kept going, laughter from the far end of the bar, the string quartet, the crystalline clink of glasses, and that indifference was somehow worse than silence. Anita Gray, kneeling in a ruined white gown on Italian marble, was not even worth the room's pause. She looked up at Han, and she touched her earring. The left one, a diamond stud, small enough to miss, fitted with something that was not a diamond at all. Nobody saw it, that was the point. 3 miles away, in a glass tower in Gangnam, a single red light began to pulse on a desk. Now here is what the men in that ballroom did not understand, what nobody outside of one very specific, very private arrangement had ever been allowed to understand. Anita Gray was not protected by Jiwan. Anita Gray was the operation. The white dress was chosen because it photographs well. The solo entrance was choreographed 3 days prior. The vulnerable wife, abandoned by a distracted husband, narrative had been fed, carefully, through 4 different channels into Han's network over 6 weeks, planted like a match near a fuse that Han had been itching to light for years. She let him light it. She needed to see exactly who was in the room when he did. The men were still laughing when the air changed. Not dramatically, no doors swinging open, no thunder of approaching footsteps. The air just compressed. The way it does before a storm that has already decided where it's going to land. And then he was simply there, standing at the edge of the circle. Midnight black suit, black button-down beneath it, obsidian eyes that moved across the 5 men with the specific, unhurried attention of someone cataloging a problem he has already solved. He was extraordinarily still. The kind of still that is not the absence of movement, but the mastery of it. The stillness of a man who has learned that the most aggressive thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to move at all. Jiwon did not look at Han. He looked at Anita. And he walked forward, slowly, and knelt in front of her on that marble floor, a man worth more in fear than most nations are worth in currency, and he took her face in both hands and wiped the single tear from her cheek. "Everyone you wanted has come," he said quietly. "All the ones you wanted are here." She nodded once. He stood, and turned to face Han for the first time. Han's phone buzzed, then the phone of the man to his left. Then all 5, in rapid succession, a chorus of notifications, each one a different institution, a different country, a different account, all carrying the same essential message. Gone. Stay with me because in 60 seconds, Jiwan hasn't touched a single one of them, and he doesn't plan to. What he does instead is so much worse. This is exactly why you need to subscribe right now. We drop new chapters every week, and you do not want to be the person finding out what happened to Han from someone else's comment section. Before we go any further, drop a below and tell me, did you catch the moment Anita actually activated everything? I want to see who was paying attention from the very first line. Now let's get back to the ballroom because Jiwan just smiled, and nobody in that room has ever seen him smile before. The wine hit the dress before she even saw the hand move. Not an accident, not a slip. A poor, slow, deliberate, and surgical, the kind of cruelty that requires an audience to feel real. And director Han made sure he had one. 5 men in expensive suits, laughing and pointing, their faces distorted by the particular ugliness of men who believe they have already won. And at the center of their circle, kneeling on Italian marble in a gown that had been white until 30 seconds ago, was Anita Gray. Her face was a mask. That was the only word for it. Not blank. A blank face is the face of someone who has gone somewhere else to survive the moment. Anita had not gone anywhere. She was entirely present, entirely contained, her dark eyes open and level and so devastatingly composed that if you had walked into that ballroom and seen her from across the room, you might have mistaken her for the one in control. You would not have been entirely wrong. 3 hours earlier, she had arrived alone. This was not unusual, and that was precisely the problem, or rather, precisely the story that had been allowed to circulate. In the world of the Lotte World Tower's annual Winter Gala, where Seoul's most powerful families moved through gilded rooms like chess pieces that had learned to drink champagne, a wife arriving without her husband was a data point, and data points, in rooms like these, became narratives faster than they became facts. The narrative, by the time Anita's car pulled to the tower's entrance, had been gestating for 6 weeks. Jiwon, the ghost of Seoul, the man whose organization operated beneath the financial surface of half the city's legitimate industry, was, according to careful and well-placed rumor, distracted. A clan dispute in the northern networks, something about a territory agreement from 3 years ago that 2 factions had decided, simultaneously, to stop honoring. Internal chaos. The kind that makes powerful men tunnel-visioned, makes them pull their attention inward, makes them forget what they've left unguarded on the outside. What they'd left unguarded, the rumor said, was her. Anita stepped from the car in white silk, floor-length, draped at the shoulder, catching the cold December light of the tower's exterior in the way that only fabric cut with real intention manages to do. Her hair was dark and full, framing a face that the city had never quite known what to do with, too elegant for the dismissals they wanted to offer her, too foreign for the acceptance they weren't prepared to give. She had lived in Seoul for 4 years and moved through it with the particular grace of a woman who had long ago decided that belonging was not a thing she needed other people to grant her. She took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and did not drink it. The room noticed her entrance the way rooms always notice the thing they've been talking about. A subtle reorientation, heads turning by degrees, conversations dipping in volume for a half-second before reasserting themselves. The wife of the ghost, alone, just as they'd heard. She moved through the room with no apparent destination, which was its own kind of destination. She paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Han River, dark and vast below, the lights of the city scattered across its edges like something broken and beautiful. She spoke briefly to a gallery curator she had met twice before. She accepted a second glass she did not drink. She was waiting. Not visibly. There was nothing in her posture that read as waiting, no scanning of the room, no checking of exits, no micro-expressions of vigilance that a trained observer might catch. She had worked very hard to remove all of those things. What was left was a woman at a party, alone and unbothered, who appeared to have no particular agenda for the evening. Which was, of course, the agenda. They found her in the private East Lounge at 9:30. She had drifted there gradually, over the span of 40 minutes, through a series of movements so natural that reconstructing them afterward would require real effort. A conversation near the bar that drew her a few meters east. A knot of guests near the entrance that nudged her toward the corridor. The lounge itself, smaller, paneled in dark walnut, lit by lamps rather than chandeliers, was the kind of space that felt private enough to make men comfortable and removed enough to make them careless. Han entered first. She had studied his photograph enough times that seeing him in person felt like watching a translation. He was taller than she'd expected, with the specific confidence of a man who had never in his adult life been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. His suit was charcoal, his tie a deep burgundy, his face arranged in the permanent expression of someone keeping score. Behind him came the others, 4 men from his network, different industries, different surnames, all sharing the essential characteristic of having aligned themselves with Han's bet that Jiwan's moment was ending. They were wrong about that, but they didn't know it yet. Han saw her, and something moved across his face. Not surprised he had known she was here, had known she would be here, had almost certainly ensured she would drift toward this room before the evening ended. What moved across his face was something more like satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has set a table and is watching his guests sit down. "Mrs. Jiwon," he said, using the form of address she had always quietly corrected and he had always quietly ignored. "I didn't expect to see you without your husband." "He had other commitments," Anita said. "Yes," Han let the word sit. "We heard." The other four arranged themselves with the casual deliberateness of men who had rehearsed this without admitting they'd rehearsed it, a loose arc, nothing so obvious as a blockade. Just a repositioning that happened to place Anita nearer the interior of the room and themselves nearer the door. The kind of geometry that announces itself only in retrospect. "You know what I've always found interesting," Han continued, moving to the side table where a bottle of Burgundy sat open, pouring himself a glass with the ease of a man in his own home, "is how certain men collect things that don't quite fit their world, art they don't understand, properties in cities they never visit." He paused, studied the glass. "Wives from entirely different civilizations." The man to his left, younger, the one she had identified as Nam, the weakest red in the group, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was designed to function as one. "I don't think Jiwan sees it that way," Anita said. "No, I'm sure he doesn't. Not initially." Han finally looked at her directly, and his eyes were the eyes of a man delivering a speech he found privately entertaining. "But these things have a natural timeline, don't they? The novelty fades, the complications accumulate. A man in his position can't afford certain kinds of optics indefinitely. Especially not now, when he's already dealing with questions about his judgment. Is there something you'd like to say to me, Director Han? Or are you enjoying the sound of your own voice?" A beat of silence. Nam's almost laugh died entirely. Han smiled. "I'd like to give you an opportunity, which is more than most people in my position would offer." He set down his glass and took a step toward her. "Your husband's primary holding company, the legitimate face of everything he runs, has been under quiet investigation for the last 8 months. We both know what's inside those accounts. And I have the documentation to make the next 18 months of his life extraordinarily complicated. Another step. Or I could lose it, in exchange for something very simple." Anita held his gaze. "What?" "A statement, recorded, about certain decisions your husband made in the past 2 years. Nothing elaborate, just enough to establish a narrative that protects certain people who are currently very uncomfortable." He tilted his head. "You'd be doing him a favor, in the long run. Men like Jiwan don't survive when the legitimate layer collapses. Help me stabilize things, and perhaps his reorganization goes more quietly than it might otherwise." The room was very still. Anita said no. And the stillness changed quality. What happened next moved quickly in the way that premeditated things always appear spontaneous. Han reached for the wine. Not for his glass, for the bottle. He poured it on her dress. Slowly, from the shoulder down. The burgundy spread through the white silk with the kind of thoroughness that cold liquid achieves on expensive fabric, immediate, total, irreversible. The smell of it rose in the air between them. "Beg," Han said. His voice was quiet now, the showmanship stripped away, what remained beneath it harder and less interesting. "Get on your knees and beg me to lose that documentation, and we can all move forward from this evening." Anita looked at her dress. Then she looked at Han. And then slowly, without breaking eye contact, she lowered herself to the floor. Not because she was afraid. Fear had left her body at some point in the last 6 weeks of preparing for this moment, the way water leaves a vessel that has been tipped on its side, completely, and without drama. What remained was something much more useful than fear, something that lived on the other side of fear and had no name in any language she'd grown up speaking, though she'd found approximations of it in Korean, in the spaces between words that Jiwan used when he was deciding something irrevocable. She knelt on the Italian marble, the ruined gown pooling around her, and her face, God, her face, still, not blank, not gone. Entirely present and entirely unmoved, the expression of a woman who is somewhere so far above this moment that the moment cannot reach her even while she is physically inside it. The men laughed. Han's was the loudest. The genuine laugh of a man who believes he has won, and the sound of it filled the walnut-paneled room and probably reached the nearest guests in the corridor, who perhaps glanced toward the lounge and then glanced away, because the first rule of the rooms these people moved through was that you did not observe the things you were not meant to observe. Nam said something in Korean she understood perfectly and did not react to. The man to Han's right held up his phone. And Anita, kneeling on that marble floor with wine on her dress and men laughing at her face, raised her left hand to her hair, a gesture so natural, so reflexive, the kind of thing a woman does without thinking when she is distressed, smoothing her hair back from her face and touched the diamond stud in her left ear. Small, pear-shaped, set in white gold. Not a diamond. Her finger pressed it once, with the particular pressure she had practiced until it was indistinguishable from the unconscious gesture of a woman trying to hold herself together. She let her hand fall back to her lap. 3 miles west, in a glass tower above Gangnam, a red light began to pulse on a desk. The office was the kind of room that communicated power through its refusals. No art on the walls, no photographs. The desk was a single slab of black granite, the chair behind it unremarkable, the room's one concession to the night, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city below. Sprawling and luminous, a thing that could be surveyed, but not entirely known. Jiwan saw the light the moment it appeared. He was standing at the window when it started, his back to the room, a phone held loosely in his right hand. He had been mid-conversation, something about the Northern Network, something that had required, in the past 6 weeks, a performance of distraction so convincing that 2 of his own lieutenants had privately expressed concern about his focus. He had let them express it. He had let the concern travel, carefully, through the precise channels where it would do the most damage to the precise people he needed to believe it. He ended the call without closing remarks. The red light pulsed 3 times and stopped. He looked at it for a moment. Something moved across his face, not the composed blankness he wore in most rooms, and not the cold that people who encountered him professionally would describe afterward in terms of temperature, of pressure, of the particular physical sensation of being in proximity to something that has decided what it's going to do. What moved across his face was something smaller and more private. Something that lived in the specific territory between his understanding of what that light meant and his understanding of everything it had cost her to press it. He set the phone on the desk. His suit was already black. It was always black midnight, bespoke, worn the way that men who have no need to signal their power wear expensive things, which is to say, without ceremony, as if the fabric were simply what existed between his body and the world. He had not needed to change. He had been dressed and ready for 4 hours, moving through the performance of a working evening, waiting for a light that his wife had told him might come tonight, or might not come for another week, depending on how quickly Han decided to move. Han had decided quickly. That was useful information. Jiwon walked to the door. His head of security was in the corridor, a man named Wu, who had been with him for 11 years and communicated almost exclusively in the specific silence of someone who already knows what you need before you articulate it. Latte Tower, Jiwon said. Wu nodded once and fell into step behind him. They moved through the building with the efficiency of something that has been rehearsed at a cellular level, not urgency, because urgency requires uncertainty about the outcome. And Jiwon had no uncertainty about the outcome. What he had instead was momentum. The particular momentum of a man walking toward a thing he has already finished. In the elevator, he looked at his reflection for a moment in the polished doors. Sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, the kind of face that photographers and security agencies both struggled to categorize, each for their own reasons. He was, as people who encountered him tended to notice before they noticed anything else, extraordinarily beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful completely, and without the softness that usually makes beauty approachable. There was nothing approachable about him. There had never been anything approachable about him. He had learned young that this was an asset if you understood how to use it, and a liability if you allowed other people to become comfortable with it. He allowed very few people to become comfortable with it. His phone showed a live feed from the lounge's security camera, not the hotel's system, which would be wiped and replaced before morning. But one of 4 that his team had placed in the room 72 hours prior, during a maintenance window that the Lotte Tower's head of security had been compensated generously not to notice. He watched the feed for exactly 8 seconds. Anita, kneeling, her face composed. Her back straight, even now, even on the floor, with wine on her dress and 5 men arranged around her, in the particular formation of people who believe themselves to be standing over something defeated. He understood, looking at her, that she was not defeated. He had understood this about her since the 3rd week of their marriage, which was approximately how long it had taken him to recognize that he had married someone who operated on entirely different architecture than anything he'd previously encountered. Not stronger in the way the word gets used carelessly, more specifically constructed. Built for exactly the kind of pressure that was currently being applied to her, in a room 3 miles away, by men who would not have the opportunity to make this mistake twice. The elevator opened. The car was waiting. The city moved past the windows in the dark, and Jiwan did not watch it. He sat very still, in the way that he was always still completely, and with the specific quality of a man who has so thoroughly mastered the habit of stillness that the absence of movement has itself become expressive, has become its own form of communication to anyone paying close enough attention. Wu, in the front seat, communicated something brief to a phone. Jiwan already knew what it contained. The financial architecture they had been building for 4 months, the specific pressure points in Han's organization that Anita had identified through 6 weeks of documented dinner conversations and a forensic accounting review she had conducted herself. The offshore structures that looked impenetrable until you understood where the actual ownership was recorded, all of it had been ready since Tuesday. The light in his office had simply been the signal that tonight was the night they used it. He looked at the city. In approximately 11 minutes, he would walk into the Lotte World Tower's East Lounge, and the men who had spent the last hour believing they were ending something would discover that they had, in fact, been completing it, that every arrogant move they had made, every recorded word, every dollar they had shifted in anticipation of Jiwan's collapse had been a thread they were pulling in a garment that Anita had already unraveled from the inside. That the woman on the floor was not a victim. That she was the reason they were in that room. That the cry they had extracted from her, the single tear, the kneeling, the performance of defeat that Han had interpreted as surrender, was not a cry at all. It was a frequency. And it had reached exactly the person it was designed to reach, at exactly the moment it was designed to reach him. The car moved through the city. The red light in the Gangnam office continued to pulse 3 times and stopped, and the night outside the window was full of the specific kind of silence that precedes things that cannot be undone. 11 minutes. Jiwan did not move. He did not need to hurry. He had already arrived, in every way that mattered. What remained was simply the formality of his body crossing the distance between where it was and where it needed to be, so that the men in that room could look at him and understand, in the specific visceral way that no amount of financial notification can fully replicate, exactly what they had done. And to whom? The tower came into view through the windshield, lit against the winter sky, its glass skin reflecting the Han River below it. Somewhere inside it, on an upper floor, 5 men were laughing. He watched the building the way he watched most things, without expression, without hurry, with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has already decided on the outcome and is simply waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. The car slowed. The door opened. And the ghost of Seoul stepped into the cold December air and began to walk. It started with the temperature. Not a dramatic drop, nothing so obvious as a chill that made people reach for their jackets or look toward the windows. It was subtler than that. The kind of shift that the body registers before the mind has language for it. A change in the quality of the air rather than the quantity of its warmth. The lounge had been close and over-bright, with the specific energy of men who believe they are the most dangerous thing in the room. And then, between one breath and the next, it wasn't. Han felt it first, though he would not have admitted this afterward, because admitting it would have required admitting that something in him recognized the shift before he understood its source, and that recognition was its own kind of confession. He was mid-sentence, something about the documentation, something about timelines. the practiced rhythm of a man who has delivered a version of this speech before and knows which cadences land when the sentence simply stopped. Not because he chose to stop it, because the air in the room had changed in a way that made continuing feel suddenly, inexplicably wrong, the way that a sound you cannot identify makes you stop moving before you know why you've stopped. Nam straightened in his chair. The man with the phone, Director Cho, 43, shipping conglomerate, third largest stake in the consortium, that had been quietly positioning against Jiwan's holdings for the better part of a year, lowered the device without being aware that he'd lowered it. The other two exchanged a glance that neither of them would remember clearly afterward. And Anita, still kneeling on the marble, still composed, still entirely present in the devastated white gown, Anita felt it too, and unlike the men, she understood exactly what it was. She had felt it before, the first time, in a conference room in Mapogu, when Jiwan had walked in while three men were in the middle of telling her something they should not have been saying. She had watched those men feel it arrive, this current, this atmospheric shift, this thing that was not a sound and not a temperature and not a presence you could point to, but was somehow all three before Jiwan had crossed the threshold, before he was visible, before any rational explanation for the feeling existed. She had asked him about it once, late at night, in their apartment above the river. Whether he knew he did it, whether the stillness he carried was something he'd cultivated, or something he'd been born with, or something the years had simply compressed into him the way pressure compresses carbon. He had considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things she asked him, with the full weight of his attention, which was the most disorienting and the most clarifying thing about him. "I don't feel it from the inside," he'd said. "You would have to tell me what it looks like from the outside." She had tried to explain it. She had said, "It feels like the moment before a storm, when the pressure changes and the birds stop, and you don't know yet what's coming, but your body does." She had said, "It feels like something has already decided." He had been quiet for a moment. "That's accurate," he'd said. Now kneeling in a ruined gown in a walnut-paneled room with five men who were beginning, without knowing why, to feel the first edges of something they had no framework for, she almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The doors did not open. This was the thing that the men would struggle to explain afterward, in the various depositions and interviews and private conversations that the next several months would generate. The doors did not open, and there was no sound of footsteps in the corridor, and there was no gradual approach, no series of events that announced an arrival the way arrivals are supposed to be announced. One moment the doorway contained only the warm light from the corridor beyond it. And then Jiwan was there, standing at the edge of the circle, perfectly still. Midnight black suit, black shirt beneath it, his hands at his sides, his face arranged in an expression that was not anger, not menace, not the theatrical display of a man who has arrived to make a point. It was something more complete than any of those things. The expression of a man for whom the outcome of the next several minutes is already so settled that what he is experiencing now is not conflict, but administration. His eyes moved across the five men once. Just once. A single, unhurried survey, the way a person glances at a document before signing it, not reading it anymore, because the reading is done, and what remains is only the formality of the pen. Then he looked at Anita. And something happened to his face that none of the five men would include in any version of events they later recounted, because it was too private to belong in a story about power, too quiet to survive the translation into the language of boardrooms and depositions. What happened was simply this. He saw her, and for one unguarded moment, the cold administration of his expression gave way to something that had no currency in the world these men operated in. Something that did not negotiate and did not perform, and was not available for anyone else in the room to hold or interpret or use. He crossed the circle. The men did not move. This was not courage. This was the specific paralysis of people who have spent the last several minutes feeling a current they couldn't name build to a level that their bodies have decided requires stillness. Han's mouth opened slightly and then closed. Nam's hand, which had been resting on the back of a chair, tightened on the wood without the rest of him moving. Jiwan walked through the middle of the circle as if it were empty. He reached Anita, and he did something that none of them expected, not because it was violent, not because it was a display of the force they had been bracing for, but because it was the opposite. He lowered himself to his knees in front of her, on that same marble floor, in that same ruined space, his bespoke suit making contact with the ground without any hesitation in the movement, as if floors and thrones were the same thing to him, and kneeling was not a diminishment. He took her face in both hands. Gently, with the specific gentleness of someone for whom gentleness toward this person is not a performance and not a decision, but simply a fact, the way gravity is a fact, the way the river outside is a fact. He wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. She held his gaze, and in her eyes was everything she did not need to say. Because they had long ago developed the particular shorthand of two people who have chosen each other in a way that does not require constant verbal ratification. He read it, the confirmation that the trap had closed, that the names she had needed were in the room, that the 6 weeks of preparation had produced exactly what they had designed it to produce. He spoke quietly enough that only she could hear it. Guanchanha, and then in English, because he always moved between languages with her the way water moves between containers, naturally, without effort. He will not be touched. You have my word. He meant Han. He meant all of them. Not touched in the physical sense. Jiwon had not been physically violent in 4 years, because 4 years ago he had reached the level of operation where physical violence was a resource you deployed through other people, and only when less expensive options had been exhausted. He meant touched in the way that mattered, undisturbed, intact, allowed to continue. He was telling her that was finished now. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he stood and turned and looked at Han. Han had, in his professional life, been looked at by a significant variety of powerful and dangerous men. He had sat across tables from people who had more lawyers than he had employees, from government officials with the specific blankness of someone who has decided to stop pretending they operate within the law, from competitors who had lost to him in ways that made them hate him with the focused intensity of a personal project. He understood how to hold himself inside a look like that. He understood the grammar of intimidation and how to respond to it without appearing to respond. What he did not have a grammar for was this. Because Jiwan was not looking at him with anger or menace or the hot, pressurized energy of someone who has been provoked. He was looking at him with something far more disorienting, which was patience. The patience of someone for whom the next 10 minutes are already historical, already done, already a thing that happened in the past that he is simply waiting for the present to catch up to. Director Han, Jiwon said. His voice was quiet. This was always the thing that caught people off guard. They expected volume. And what they got instead was the specific register of a man who has never in his adult life needed to raise his voice because the alternative to listening was always, in every room, worse than listening. I want to thank you, Jiwon continued, for making yourself so easy to find. Han's mouth moved. What came out was less a sentence than the infrastructure of one. You don't, this is whatever she told you. She told me nothing, Jiwan said. You told me everything. 6 weeks ago, when you began redirecting the Incheon Consortium funds through the Macau shell. 5 weeks ago, when you met with the trade attaché who is not, as it happens, employed by the Trade Ministry. 3 weeks ago, when you accessed documentation about my holding company through a server that you believed was clean and was not. He paused. You told me everything. I simply needed you in a room where you could not dispute that I had heard it. A silence. Nam made a small sound. This room, Jiwan said, has 4 cameras that my team installed on Wednesday. The conversation you had with my wife has been recorded in sufficient quality for 17 different legal applications. The documentation you brought with you tonight, the documentation you threatened her with, was compiled using information that was fed to you, deliberately and with great care, over the past 2 months. He looked at Han with the expression of a man reading a list he has already memorized. None of it is real. All of what you said on camera is. Han's face had gone through several transitions in the last 30 seconds. What had settled on it now was something that was not quite fear, and not quite understanding the specific expression of a man who is in the process of revising, at speed, his entire model of what the last 6 weeks have actually been. You used her, Han said. The words came out with an edge of something that might have been, in a different man, a moral objection. You used your own wife as... I used nothing, Jiwan said, and for the first time, something shifted at the edge of his voice. Not heat, it did not become warm. It became, instead, more precise, the way cold becomes more itself at lower temperatures. My wife designed the operation. She identified you. She built the financial case. She selected the location, the timing, and the specific sequence of provocations most likely to make you overcommit on camera. He let a beat pass. I was simply the last piece she needed. The reason for you to stay in the room long enough to say everything you said. Han stared at him, then looked at Anita, who was watching him from across the circle with an expression of such complete, such total calm, that it was only in this moment, looking at her now with the full context of what Jiwan had just said, that he understood what he had been looking at all evening and mistaken for devastation. He had been looking at a woman who was finished waiting. The first phone went off at 11:07. Director Cho looked at his screen with the reflexive attention of a man who receives important notifications at all hours, the kind of attention that is supposed to project importance and instead, in this moment, projected only the specific vulnerability of someone receiving news they were not prepared for. His face changed. The change was small, and then it was not small. Nam's phone followed 30 seconds later. He read the notification twice, which told Jiwan everything he needed to know about Nam's relationship with disbelief. Then the others, in the space of 4 minutes, each in their own sequence. Han last, which was intentional, because Anita had specifically requested that his come last had said, "When they were planning this, I want him to watch the others fall first. I want him to have 40 seconds of knowing what's coming and not being able to stop it." She understood, Jiwan had thought then, and thought again now, watching Han's face as the notification arrived, the particular architecture of consequence, that it is not enough for a thing to happen. It must be felt in the correct order. The notifications were from 7 different institutions across 4 jurisdictions. They were not identical, they had been crafted to arrive from independent sources, because independent sources are harder to contest than a single coordinated action, and Anita had spent 11 days ensuring that each one was legally airtight before she signed off on the sequence. Han's primary operating company, under investigation by the Financial Intelligence Unit, assets frozen pending review. The Incheon Consortium holding, flagged for irregular cross-border transfers, all accounts suspended. Han's personal accounts, 3 domestic, 2 in Singapore, 1 in the Cayman structure he believed no one outside his private banking team knew existed, frozen, each accompanied by the case number of a proceeding that had been filed not tonight, not this week, but 6 weeks ago, when Anita had first confirmed the name of the shell company through which everything else flowed. 6 weeks ago. While Han had been planning how to use her, she had already finished. The room was quiet in a way that had a specific quality to it, not the silence of people waiting for something to happen, but the silence of people inside something that is happening and has no pause function. Cho sat down without appearing to decide to sit. Nam was looking at his phone with the expression of a man hoping that looking harder will change the contents. The other 2 had moved, by some instinct, slightly apart from Han, the unconscious distancing of people who understand, at the body level before the mind has confirmed it, that proximity to him is no longer a safe coordinate. Han stood very still. He was looking at his phone, his face had resolved, after the transitions of the last 10 minutes, into something that was in some ways more honest than anything he'd worn all evening. The performance had gone out of it. What remained was simply a man looking at the specific shape of everything he had built, and understanding that the shape had changed permanently while he was in this room. "The cameras," he said finally. His voice was different, quieter, and not in the way that Jiwon's quietness was a weapon. In the way that certain things become quiet when the force that animated them has been removed. "Will be retrieved," Jiwan said, "after you've left the building. Along with the recording, which will be held rather than submitted, provided the next 90 days proceed in a way that doesn't require us to submit it." He paused. "That is not a negotiation. It's an instruction." Han looked up from the phone. "The investigation is real," Jiwan continued. "The frozen accounts are real. Those will proceed on their own timeline, because they were filed with institutions that operate independently of what either of us want. What my wife built is real, Director Han. She built it from your own transfers, your own communications, your own documented decisions. There is nothing in those files that is fabricated, because she didn't need to fabricate anything. You provided everything she needed. A long silence. What do you want? Han said. Nothing from you, Jiwon said. What I wanted was in this room 2 hours ago. The other names. The other accounts. The inside of the network you've been building for the past 18 months using information that was being leaked to you from inside my organization. He held Han's gaze. We have all of that now. You were generous with it, on camera, when you believed you were speaking to a woman without protection. He tilted his head slightly. That's all. Han looked at Anita again. She met his look with the same expression she had worn all evening, the same complete, the same unmoved, the same quality of presence that he had read, at every point in the last several hours, as something other than what it was. He understood now what he had been reading. He had been reading competence, and mistaking it for composure. He had been reading strategy, and mistaking it for endurance. He had been looking directly at the most dangerous person in the room all night. Anita stood up. Not with the careful, tentative movement of someone testing whether their legs will hold. She rose with the fluid, uninterrupted motion of a woman who had decided to stand, and saw no reason to make the action complicated, the ruined white silk settling around her as she reached her full height. Her spine straight, her shoulders back, her dark eyes moving across the room with the unhurried attention of someone taking a final inventory of something they no longer need. She smoothed the front of the gown once, a small gesture, practical rather than vain, the action of a person who understands that details are the last thing you attend to before you leave a room. She walked to Jiwan and stood beside him, not behind him, not at an angle that suggested shelter or deference, but directly beside him, her shoulder at the level of his arm, the two of them occupying the same horizontal plane in the way that people do when they understand themselves to be genuinely equivalent. He didn't look at her, she didn't look at him, they didn't need to. The names you gave us tonight, Anita said, addressing the room for the first time since she'd spoken to Han directly, her voice carrying the specific quality of someone making a record rather than having a conversation, will be cross-referenced against the financial trail over the next 2 weeks. If the cross-reference is clean, if the involvement was limited to what you disclosed on camera tonight, then the investigation proceeds without your active cooperation being required. She paused. If the cross-reference is not clean, the recording becomes relevant. Cho looked up. We didn't disclose. You did, Anita said. You discussed the Busan routing in enough detail that Director Yoon's name came up 4 times in 11 minutes. You discussed the timeline of the Incheon transfer in enough detail that the attachment point in the northern network is identifiable from context alone. She held his gaze with a steadiness that made him look away first. I've been listening to you for 4 hours. You disclosed a great deal. The room had nothing left in it to say. It was one of the things Anita had learned about the specific moment when consequence becomes concrete, that people run out of language for it very quickly. The negotiations, the maneuvering, the verbal sparring that feels so essential in the hours before everything changes, it all evaporates when the change arrives. What's left is just people in a room, in the particular silence of understanding that the version of themselves they walked in with no longer exists. She had designed this silence. She had worked backward from it, 6 weeks ago, when she had sat in the Gangnam office with a whiteboard and a cup of tea and the patient, exacting attention she brought to every problem that mattered to her, and she had mapped the sequence that would produce it. Every move Han had made tonight had been a move she had predicted, had accounted for, had in some cases actively encouraged through the information she had ensured reached him the rumor of Jiwan's distraction, the apparent openness of her vulnerability, the specific detail about the holding company's documentation that she had allowed to circulate, because she knew it would make Han believe he had leverage he didn't have. The white dress had been chosen because it photographs well in low light, and because white stains in ways that are immediately visible on camera, and because there was a version of this evening where Han didn't pour anything and a version where he did. And she had dressed for both, and she had been prepared for both, and the dress was now ruined, and she did not care even slightly. She had what she came for. She reached into the small evening bag at her side. It had been there all evening, and no one had paid attention to it, because evening bags at galas are invisible. They are the furniture of formal rooms, and she produced a folded document. She set it on the table beside the open wine bottle. That's a summary of what was filed tonight and with whom, she said. It includes the case numbers and the contact information for the relevant compliance officers. You'll want to retain counsel in the morning. She paused. Good counsel. Not the firm you currently use. They have a conflict that will become apparent by Thursday. She had identified the conflict 7 weeks ago. She stepped back and looked at the room one final time. Han, still standing with his phone in his hand, the document she'd left sitting beside the bottle that had ruined her dress. The 4 men arranged in the loose, uncertain geometry of people who have lost the thread of where they're supposed to stand, and she felt, as she always felt at the completion of something she'd built carefully, a kind of quietness that was not relief and not triumph, but something more like the specific satisfaction of a thing placed correctly. A weight set down in the right position, an equation resolved. She turned. Jiwan moved beside her without a word. They walked out of the lounge together, through the corridor, back into the main ballroom, where the string quartet was still playing, and the champagne was still circulating, and the city's most powerful people were still performing their choreography of wealth and influence, entirely unaware of what had just concluded 20 meters away. Anita moved through the room the way she had moved through it at the beginning of the evening, without apparent destination, without urgency, with the complete and unhurried ease of a woman who has nothing to prove and nowhere to be except exactly where she is. Jiwon's hand found the small of her back. Not possessively, not protectively. The way that people touch each other when the touch is not communication but simply presence, the physical equivalent of, I'm here, you're here, we are the same thing in this moment. She leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. They crossed the ballroom and reached the entrance, and descended toward the waiting car, and behind them, the Latte World Tower continued its evening in the way that grand buildings continue their evenings, indifferent to the specific human collapses occurring within them, full of light and glass and the city's reflection in its own dark windows. In the East Lounge, Director Han sat down. He sat down because his legs had made the decision for him, had recognized before the rest of him caught up that the evening was over and the standing was no longer necessary, and what came next would not be navigated on his feet. The document Anita had left sat on the table. His phone's screen had gone dark. The other men were in various states of their own recalibration. Cho on the phone already, speaking quietly and quickly to someone he clearly hoped could help. Nam staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone revising every conversation they'd had in the last 6 weeks. The other 2 had moved toward the door, which said everything about their assessment of what loyalty to Han was currently worth. Han picked up the document. He read it. He set it down. He looked at the wine bottle, and the glass he had poured for himself, and the stain on the marble where the burgundy had overflowed when he'd poured it on her dress, and he understood in the specific, unambiguous way that a man understands something when all the alternative interpretations have been removed, that the woman who had knelt on that floor had never been kneeling. She had been deciding. She had been in that position because she chose to be, because it gave her the angle she needed, the patience she required, the image that the camera would preserve, and that his own voice would narrate with extraordinary helpfulness. She had been on the floor of his design, and inside a plan of her own. And the distance between those 2 things, between what he had believed he was looking at, and what had actually been in the room with him all evening, was the exact distance between who he had thought he was and who he would be. By morning. Outside, the car moved through the December streets. Anita looked at the city through the window, the Han River coming into view, dark and wide, the lights of Gangnam on its far shore. The glass tower where the red light on Jiwon's desk had already been extinguished because there was nothing left to signal. The Northern Network names, she said. Did you recognize them? 2 of them, Jiwon said. I thought you would. The 3rd is newer. I'll send you what I have on him. In the morning. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was watching the city with the same expression he'd worn since they left the lounge, settled, finished. The administrative coldness of earlier in the evening already receding into the version of him that existed only in this specific context, in the back of this car, with the city moving past and nothing left to execute. The dress, he said. I have 3 more in that exact cut, she said. Different colors. I ordered them when I chose white for tonight. He looked at her. She looked back at him. You ordered backup dresses, he said. I ordered backup dresses. A beat of silence. And then, in the dim interior of the car, with the city streaming past the windows and the Han River wide and dark beneath them, something moved across his face that was rare and private, and belonged to no one in the world except the woman sitting beside him, a warmth that his face was not architecturally designed to carry, and carried anyway. "Dangsine un jongjinehen mugia," he said quietly. "You are a terrifying weapon." She turned back to the window. "I know," she said. The car moved on through the city, and the night held them in its specific silence, and behind them the Latte World Tower stood against the winter sky, full of light, full of consequence, full of the particular ruins that careful, patient, brilliant women leave behind when they finally decide to stop waiting and simply finish what they came to do.